And so if you don't know what that is, and you're waiting for one day to start living your life, like when I retire, when I make X amount of dollars, you probably are not living life on your terms.
83% of Americans identify as not very happy, which can hold you back and negatively affect your relationships and your business. On this podcast, we discuss the proven steps to happiness so you can restore balance and rekindle your joy.
Welcome to another episode of How to Be Happier for Entrepreneurs. I hope you're having an amazing day. And if you're not, turn it around and make it an amazing day. We have an awesome guest from Steamboat, Colorado. Marni, welcome to the show.
Love it. I'm already having a great day now. It just got 10% better from that intro.
Awesome. And we are going to talk about some really cool stuff about living life without limits, how to live your authentic life, just how to be more happier in general. So let's jump right in. And let me ask you the first question, and that is, what are some common thought patterns that hold most people back from living this authentic life, and how can we overcome them?
Well, I think that most people, well, I like to tell a little story, Brad. So, what is your favorite fantasy, like movie, book, TV show, Game of Thrones, Marvel? What's your cup of tea?
Well, as a kid, I used to love the A-Team so much that I told my two older sisters, when I get a car, I'm going to put the A-Team on my license plate. And they're like, no, you're never going to do that. And I never did.
Okay, I love the A-Team. Okay, so in any sort of great show that you watch or book that you read, right? If it's well done, you launch in and you believe the rules of the world that the author writer sets up, right? You're like, yeah, cars fly, and there's the blip, and whatever it is. If it's well done, there are these rules, and you believe it. And what happens is, in our lifetime, we grow up with a specific set of beliefs that are rules of our world, and they're really ingrained. And we often don't know that other people don't see the world or what's possible or not possible like we do. And so if we grew up thinking that things are hard, or things have to be painful to get what you want, or dreams are only for people who do X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, right? You're going to grow up with those belief systems, and you're going to live it like they're rules. And so what happens is that those rules are so deeply unconscious and embedded in how we do everything and how we even have an identity ourselves, that we end up living in a tiny little world of possibility that is so limiting. And so we create these shoulds, and the shoulds are ruining and ruling your life.
So can you give us like a real life example of what's something in early childhood that someone could have formed a belief about that's keeping them in this little box?
Yeah, totally. So I'll tell you a story, my own story. So when I was 10, so my dad was working in a family business. My ancestors came over here in like 1894, before there was even Ellis Island. They came to Boston. And my great grandfather was like a peddler, and he lived through like Great Panic of 1918, then the Depression. He had all these sons. They had this business, right? So it was like this really like 100+ year old business. And my dad came home from work one day when I was 10 years old. I was sitting on my red shag carpet, watching the Brady Bunch. And he came in, I'll never forget it. And he said, hi. And he was like, I quit the family business today. And I literally looked over, Brad, and I was like, are we going to be poor? And he was like, no. And I was like, okay. But here's what I realized. Number one is that set this pattern of like worrying about not having enough, and risk taking. And in the good part of that was my dad started his own thing. The not so great part of that was that pretty much for the rest of my childhood, my dad was always trying to prove to everyone, his relatives, himself, he was an only child, that he was successful. And so it was never enough. He never felt like he hit it. He had richer friends, he had richer family members, right? And so I sort of grew up with this thing of like, I have to prove that I'm enough through creating success and wealth. And I got divorced. I was 38 years old. I had small kids. I hadn't worked for like 10 years. And I sort of started my business with this deep core belief of like, I have to prove to my ex-husband, I have to prove to my family, I have to prove to everyone that I'm successful. I did it. And so then everything I did wasn't really based on what do I want or what do I believe or what do I think. I was always just sort of searching around to see what everyone else did so that I could finally be successful. And I built this business that was great in a lot of ways and I helped a lot of people. But in the end, I never even considered, is this the business or the life that I want?
What was the business?
So I started this business in 2009. It was a coaching business. And at the time I'd been single for 5 years. I wanted to write a book about dating and I was trying to sell this book and got an agent and she tried to sell it and she came back and she was like, a book isn't a business. You have to build a platform. And I was like, is that a shoe? Like, I don't even know what that means. Right. And so I built this coaching business and the model, like in my brain, and this was before Mel Robbins. So I was like Tony Robbins. I was like, I just want to build a Tony Robbins business. I want to have like all these divisions and I'm going to have all these people that work for me and I'm going to have thousands and tens of thousands of people in my program. I mean, that was my thing. I'm like, I'm going to be the girl Tony Robbins. And so I set my sights on that. And I was like a machine, Brad. Like I was relentless.
And how did it turn out?
So what happened was that we grew and incrementally. And then I started following all these gurus, in the coaching space and hiring people and trying to emulate. This is when I look back at it, I'm like, oh Lord. So this is a great example. 2020, COVID happens, right? And virtual events start happening, right? And you start seeing like all these really big, huge speakers doing these huge events with like 30,000 people. So Marni goes and she takes a class that the organizer of these events is teaching. And I decide I'm going to do a version of that. Like exactly like that. Like I'm going to maybe have 200 people, but I'm going to have all the bells and whistles and I'm going to do every single thing that Tony Robbins did on his event. So that event probably cost me about $80,000 or $90,000 to put on for 200 people. Now, granted, I made a lot of money from that event, right? But because I didn't have a lot of other systems in place and I was too afraid to fire my marketing guy who wasn't doing a good job, but he was really loyal and he was really nice. I had those 200 people and then I did it again. And this time I had 130 people and I made less money, but it cost me the same. And then it kept getting smaller and smaller and I wasn't getting any new leads. And it was like imploding. And I believed like, well, just throw more money at it. Like that's what everyone else does, hire more people. And everything started to like blow up. And I had a ski accident right before COVID. And I ended up flat on my back, wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to move without pain. I had to be in bed for 3 months. I broke seven cracks in my sacrum,
Whoa.
which is, you can really, when I go to the doctor, people will be like, did you get in a car accident? I'd be like, no. It's like, you don't just break your sacrum. And in that time, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't sit up without pain. I couldn't read. I could barely watch TV. I couldn't write. I couldn't go downstairs. Like I was living in my bed with a claw so that I could reach like the remote and, like a bell to get my husband and my kids. They were back home then to come up. And I just had this realization that I had built my whole life on doing, and that I was so uncomfortable being, and that I had to break the foundation of my physical self so that I could rebuild with a new foundation where I actually was living a heart-centered, driven life based on my soul and what I really, really wanted to do in my life. So it was pretty profound. I was like, I don't even like this business. I'm not even coaching anymore. I'm like managing and babysitting. And it was like my days were crazy, meetings back to back to back, getting further and further away from the people that I really actually wanted to help. And I was like, I don't even know if this is what I want to do anymore.
Yeah, your story is so similar to mine, Marnie. I had a father who didn't think he was enough, and everything was about money. It's just making more money, and he took crazy risk and lost millions of dollars doing it. And then I did the same thing. I took crazy risk between 2005 and 2017, and lost $9 million making 5 business mistakes. Yeah, I was looking for everything on the outside. So this was that your story you shared was really profound. Did you make this change on your own, or did you seek outside help?
Well, I ultimately was looking. So, in my book, I talk about like an empty nest and a broken wing. So, COVID happened, and then when we all realized it wasn't, going to go away in 6 weeks, my adult kids were like, "We're going home." Like, this was fun. The backyard thing was fun, but Mom, we're leaving. My last daughter went to college. And I didn't like my business. My husband was so unhappy in LA. He sort of was like, I've waited for these kids to leave. Like, let's get the hell out of here. And I was so afraid of changing anything because I had built everything, doing it this one way. I didn't know how to do anything differently. And I was like, how do I figure this out? Like, what, I don't know what I want. I don't know who I am. What do I do? So I went online, as one does, and I couldn't find any resources for women in midlife who had everything that they thought they wanted and didn't know what to do next because they weren't sure if this was really the meaningful life that they had thought it was going to be. And I was looking for coaches. I was looking for books. And that's when I came upon this woman named Jessica, who has this company with her husband called the Pioneers. And their whole thing is financial independence. Well, they work with 30-year-olds. I'm like, at this time, like 55. I'm like, there's no Coast FI for me, I've missed that window. But what I liked about what she did was that she introduced me to this life design model that is based on Stanford University's design thinking model that consultants use to develop products. And I started getting interested in this model. My daughter actually at the time was a consultant. I didn't even know that this was what she did. So funny. But I was like, okay, wait. The thing about this design thinking model is you have to get to know the user of the product before you design the product, right? And there's this phase called the empathy phase. And I talk about this in my book because I needed to discover who am I now, because the life I built was designed by and for someone else who I wasn't anymore. And so Jessica really showed me that model. And then I realized that without the spiritual framework to change your life, and the inner work to shift your identity, you will just keep looking at that great idea you have of this prototype of this product, but you won't ever do anything about it. So I DJ mix mastered that process with my own process and actually created a plan of how I really wanted to start designing my life with my husband. And we set out on that journey, which ended up that we sold our house. I can tell you more about that. We sold our house. We put most of our stuff for sale, a little bit in storage. We ended up living in an RV for a year to really figure out like, who am I and what blows my hair back? And that journey I ended up selling my book. I ended up blowing up my business, shutting it down, pivoting, rebranding, creating the business that you and I are talking about now, and moving to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, which is something I never could have thought of intellectually, sitting in my bed going, what should I do with my life?
Boom. I love it. What a great story. So I want to ask you about your book and the 7 spiritual questions. But first, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, do you have some of this childhood programming and stories that are running your life, running/ruining, and keeping you from being the authentic self and having all the abundance that you possibly should or could have? Then do yourself a favor, your family a favor, your health a favor, your business a favor. Go to unlocklimitlessyou.com/quiz and take our 3-minute self-love quiz. It may start you on a journey that will forever change your life in ways that right now you might not even be able to imagine. I'm sure, Marni, like 5 years ago, you probably couldn't imagine the life that you're living now. Is that accurate?
100,000,000%. I couldn't have thought it.
Love it. So go take the quiz right
Definitely.
now.
Go take the quiz, guys.
And walk on this journey with us. It's awesome. So your book, I want to hear about your book, and I want to hear about these 7 spiritual questions. They seem pretty awesome.
Yeah. So my dad ended up getting cancer, unfortunately, and so in 2019, he ended up in the hospital. He was a super funny guy, so he just thought it was like a staycation for the weekend. He used to call the Mayo Clinic like the Ritz, like you just go in, you get some food, and you go out on Monday. So I would say he wasn't planning on dying that weekend, but he did. And so while he was sort of like fading, he started mumbling, maybe you'll relate to this with your dad, about his credit cards. And I was like, so upset and terrified and grieving, like I'm losing my best friend. My mom had already passed away. But there's this part of me, Brad, that was like, wait, literally at the end of your life, you're worried about your credit card bills and like money. And that sat with me for a while after he passed away. I was like, here's this great guy. He had all these people around him who loved him. And that was going through his mind at the end of his life. And a couple of months later, I was sitting at a service for the Jewish high holidays, and the rabbi gave this sermon, and he talked about these 7 questions. They're in the Old Testament, and the story goes, you're at the gates of heaven, and you're asked these 7 questions, like, did you lead a meaningful life? And it got me thinking, like, did my dad lead a meaningful life? Am I leading a meaningful life? And so by the time the ski accident happened and I started looking at this design thinking model, I was like, I need a different definition of success, because otherwise I'll just design another version of the life I already have. So I need to change the metrics and refocus on what really, really is going to make me at the end of my life, I hope, looking back and being like, wow, I freaking like skidded into the casket with some wounds and maybe some broken bones that healed, right? But like I lived a full life. I didn't let life live me. And so these questions then became this framework that I started to study and teach to other people, and really became the basis for like the mindset and the heart set that you need while you're actually designing a life that you love.
So what are these questions?
Well, I can give you the whole list. It's kind of boring, but I can dive into 1 or 2 of them.
Okay.
But essentially, they are, well, let me tell you a story about the first one, because I think it's really interesting and you will appreciate it given what you told me about yourself. So the very first question, in the ancient text, I've universalized them. I've made them modern, right? And I changed the order. But the original one, the OG question says, were you honest with money? And the thinking behind that was that, money, we were like typically like this, right? And we're not honest about it. We can do a little here, do a little there, right? And the thinking was like, well, if you're honest with money, the thing that is your security, then you're going to probably be honest with other parts of your life. And I was like, that's interesting, but here's how I think about it. And so this is the question in the book. It's, were you radically honest with yourself? Because I think that, minus like white lies and things like that. I always joke like the 10 commandments are like the basics. These 7 questions are the advanced moves, right? And so it's like, it's easier to be honest with other people than it is to be honest with ourselves. And if we're not honest with ourselves, then we settle for a backup life. We keep putting things off. We cope with stuff. We tolerate things. We don't look at our own childhood issues, and we just try to bury things and put them under the rug. We don't have conversations that we need to have. We create resentments and anger and lots of different things. And so this question about were you honest with yourself is a really important one, because most people that I meet are really good at coping.
So, what does it mean to are you honest with money? What do you think they meant by that?
They meant that are you in integrity with how you use money, spend money,
Give money?
give money, pay people, like on every level, right? Because most of us will do everything to just keep as much for ourselves and minimize everything else, right? And remember, these were written like in theory. It's obviously a story, but like, you know, millions of years ago, whatever. So you're like, okay, imagine that as the context. But yeah, so money is something that we usually aren't honest about with ourselves, you know, and so we think it's going to make us happy.
Yeah.
Right. So you said like I made those 5 mistakes, and you're like, oh, that would be a whole. I'm gonna have you on my podcast so we could talk about that. Right. But like diving into that, right? And it really comes with like honesty with yourself, you know, about all the decisions that you make, financial, relational, with your kids, like all of those things. Are you really being honest with yourself? Because without self-honesty, then it's really hard to make any kind of decision in your life that is meaningful. And so think back, fast forward, you know, it's your last day of life, and you're like, were you honest with yourself? And people don't want to live with regret.
Yeah, I've told people, several people in the last couple of months, I think so for 47 years, I thought I was in a business that I didn't really, it was all about money. I got into the business in real estate because I thought it would make a lot of money, because I thought money would bring me worth and value and love, because that's what my dad taught me is he loved me by giving me money, right? And I just say, when you're laying on your deathbed, I think the 2 most important questions are, what impact did you make? And then what were your relationships like with the people that meant the most to you, that were closest to you? Everything else doesn't matter. But for, you know, half of my life, I'm 51. So for most of my life, I'm thinking I'm going to live to be 110. So for half of my life, I believe that money was, you know, the thing that was going to bring me happiness. And man, it does not bring happiness.
It doesn't. And I had a client once many years ago who realized, she's like, wow, work will never love me back. And that's the same thing about money. You know, it will never love you. It will, because the thing is, and it's really interesting. I'm taking this class now, this Science of Happiness. It's on Coursera. Anyone can take it. But Science of Happiness. And she was talking, and this professor at Yale's talking about how that they've done all this research, right? And so like the minute you make X, like the way our brain works, like the goal just gets further away. And you're like, okay, well now I need this. And if I look at my business that I started, I remember when I made my first, you know, $100,000, I was like, yay. And then I was like, we must break $2 million. $2 million is the number, you know, like that's the thing. And I just was like, that's all I saw was $2 million. Right. And so it's like, if we go in that paradigm, then we're constantly running. It's an endless marathon with no finish line, right? And so one of the first things to get honest about is like, is that really what you want? Because money is a feeling that you want, right? To have that money. And so what we want to do is we want to look at, well, like, how can we create that feeling internally? I had that with my house. Like, when we were going to move, I realized like this house gave me stability because it had value. And I was like, I can never sell this thing. Like literally, like if I'm like a homeless, toothless lady at 90, it'll be because I sold this house. You know, my dad was like, you're never broke. You have your house. And so selling it was like, you know, and I had my I got a divorce there, and then I built this life and this financial security, and it was my house, even though I remarried and I raised my kids there. I felt like my house and the money that it represent was my security. And so I was terrified to sell it, to change, to leave. I thought that without it, I would be like floating out in space.
So just give us one more. What do you think is the second most impactful spiritual question?
Yeah. So the second one that I really love is, did you seek wisdom? Because most people are seeking knowledge and information, and they think that the how is going to solve their problem. In fact, they will do anything to avoid the self-worth, self-esteem, childhood wound problem. They're like, I just need a strategy, right? And knowledge will not really solve that kind of problem. And so then most people ask questions that are how based. Like, what's the best strategy? What's the next best move I need to do? What should I do this? Should I do that? They also ask questions that have no answers. Like, why did this happen to me? Why did he do that? What does it mean when this happens? Right? All external, that you will waste so much of your life's energy answering questions that you will never answer. And so when you start to seek wisdom, you are actually asking questions that, when you reflect on them, will give you the inner insights based on all your experiences, based on who you are. Pepper it with some divine insights, right? And magic unlocks when you start to seek wisdom. And in my book, I have 120 wisdom seeking questions in the back of it, because when I've been coaching for the last years, I always like reel them off. I'll like be in a coaching session, I'll ask them questions, be like, write that down. And I'm like, okay, I got to put them in the book. So they're questions. Like, my favorite one that's in the book is this. So if your listeners can listen to this and write it down, but it's, what's the problem I'm pretending to have that's keeping me from answering the real problem I have?
That's powerful.
Right? And people are like, wait, I don't get it. And so my suggestion is, like, write it down and then go on a walk and kind of break it down. Like, I break it into sections. So you're out walking, you're like, what's the problem I'm pretending to have? So that I can have the problem. What's the problem, right? That is really my problem. What is really my problem? And so when you think about that, you meditate on it, and then you do some journaling, people usually come up with some crazy stuff. All the questions dovetail, right? So that also allows you to have some self-honesty, right? So ask questions that unlock your wisdom, because those questions, when you discover what I call the essential problem, it's the one below the problem you think you have in your business or in your life. That's the problem you want to solve, because if you keep chasing the problem you think you have, you're just going to end up chasing your tail.
Yeah, so you probably work with business owners like myself, and I tell them all the time, you don't need another marketing plan. You don't need another mastermind. You don't need a business coach. You need to figure out these self-limiting beliefs that were created decades ago that are affecting you today. And it is incredible when these folks have these breakthroughs. I mean, you said that money is bringing this feeling, right? Well, that's what most entrepreneurs, including myself, is, if I get this much money, I'll have this feeling. And the irony is, no, you won't. If you need to get the feeling, if you want to get the feeling today, you can. And then once you have that feeling of happiness and inner joy, the chances of you making the money are going to go through the roof, because you're not doing it for the reason of trying to make yourself feel good like you and I and our fathers did. What's the name of the book?
It's called Your Radical Living Challenge: 7 Questions for Leading a Meaningful Life.
And what's the name of your podcast?
Life Check Yourself.
Love it. And what do you do for people? What type of person should reach out to you, and how can they reach out if they want to either find out more about you or work with you?
That's so generous. So what I do is I help mostly women, but I've worked with men too. I help them figure out why they're stuck, dismantle the shoulds that are keeping them frozen, and then actually figure out who you are now by creating what I call your soul map, which is what you love to do, how you best carry that out and your core motivations. And we build that map out, and then we start to help you design your life, your business based on what blows your hair back, so that you can start having a joyful, meaningful life without having to blow up the life that you have. So it's super fun.
So last question is, how can someone identify if they are living life on their own terms or if they're just living life for someone else or society?
I love this question. Well, first of all, it's like, if you don't know what your own terms are, that's a good sign. That's a good sign, right? What would you do if you could? What is your ideal day? What is your vision 5 or 10 years from now? Like, what kind of legacy do you want to lead? What is it that your impact that you want to make? What are your ideal working conditions? Where do you want to live? Like, what is your exact, what fills you up socially, emotionally? What environment is like best for you? When you actually have this soul map and you start experimenting with what could actually make you feel like your life is a Jackson Pollock of your soul, and actually imagine that, right? Like your family, your house, your career, your friends, your activity, your fitness, everything is just literally you expressing yourself. That feels really freaking fun. And so if you don't know what that is, and you're waiting for one day to start living your life, like when I retire, when I make X amount of dollars, you probably are not living life on your terms.
Love it. And where can people find you?
Well, they can go to marnibattista.com, and I too have a little quiz. And if they go there, they can find it to figure out their personality type to see if they're going to actually fulfill on their dreams.
Love it. Marni, that was awesome. Thank you for being on the show.
So fun.
That concludes another episode of How to Be Happier for Entrepreneurs. Remember, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people break down and just crush these self-limiting beliefs that are hidden in their subconscious mind that are holding them back from a life of abundance. So I can't do this alone. I need your help. So please share, rate, review. Anything you can do to share this message would be greatly appreciated. Until next time, love heals all.
Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more life-changing content. And if you're struggling, you don't have to. Go to bradchandler.com/contact. There, you can join the Facebook community of like-minded entrepreneurs, and you'll see a button to schedule your freedom and happiness call. See you on the next episode.